On my wedding night, my stepbrother took my husband aside and said, "You could do better than her." My husband laughed and nodded. I overheard everything, and the next morning, they woke up to a news headline that made them realize their mistake. I-28F. Never thought my wedding night would end with me plotting the most satisfying revenge of my life, but here we are. The day started perfectly. After months of planning, everything fell into place. The venue looked stunning, my dress fit like a dream, and for once, my stepfamily actually showed up without causing immediate drama. My stepbrother had even given what seemed like a heartfelt speech during the reception, talking about family and new beginnings. I should have known better. My husband and I had retreated to our honeymoon suite around midnight, exhausted but happy. The hotel was one of those fancy places with paper-thin walls that rich people somehow convince themselves are soundproof. I had stepped onto the balcony for some air while he used the bathroom, when I heard familiar voices from the adjacent balcony. My stepbrother's voice carried clearly through the night air. He told my husband that he could do so much better than me, that I was holding him back, that someone with his potential shouldn't settle for damaged goods like me. The words hit like physical blows, but what came next destroyed me completely. My husband laughed. Not a nervous, uncomfortable laugh, but genuine amusement. He agreed that he probably could do better, said he'd been having second thoughts for months but felt trapped by all the wedding preparations. My stepbrother encouraged him to think about an annulment, said it wasn't too late to escape. I stood frozen on that balcony, still in my wedding dress, listening to my new husband discuss our marriage like it was a business mistake he needed to correct. They talked for another 20 minutes about my flaws, my family's modest background, how I'd never fit into his social circle. My stepbrother even offered to help him find a good lawyer. When my husband came back inside, I pretended to be asleep. He slipped into bed beside me, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. By morning, I had a plan. I woke up early and told him I was going down to grab coffee and pastries for breakfast. Instead, I drove straight to my office. Working in public relations for a major firm had its advantages, especially when you needed to move fast and had connections everywhere. See, my stepbrother had always been the golden child, successful, charming, and completely convinced of his own invincibility. What he didn't know was that I'd been quietly documenting his questionable business practices for years, not out of malice, but because I'm thorough by nature and something about his rapid success never added up. His consulting firm had been cutting corners on safety inspections for construction projects, falsifying reports, and taking bribes from contractors. I had copies of emails, financial records, and even recorded phone calls from when he'd gotten careless around me. I'd never planned to use any of it, but desperate times called for desperate measures. I spent 3 hours that morning crafting the perfect press release and reaching out to every contact I had in local media. By noon, the story was breaking on every major news outlet in the city. The headline read, "Local business owner faces federal investigation for construction safety fraud, multiple building projects under review." I made sure to include just enough detail to make it clear this wasn't going away quietly. The FBI had been notified, several of his biggest clients were already distancing themselves, and his business partner was reportedly cooperating with authorities. But that was just the opening act. While the news was breaking, I was already executing Phase 2. I called my husband's boss, someone I'd met several times at company events, and mentioned how concerned I was about my husband's judgment. I shared how he'd been bragging about some questionable investment advice he'd been giving clients, advice that skirted ethical guidelines. I didn't lie, he actually had been doing this, thinking he was being clever. I just made sure the right person finally heard about it. Then I called his mother. His mother had never liked me, always making subtle comments about how her son deserved someone more refined. So I played into that perfectly. I told her, with just the right amount of tearful confusion, about the strange conversation I'd overheard between her son and my stepbrother. How they'd been discussing some kind of business deal that sounded potentially illegal, and how worried I was about my new husband getting involved with my stepbrother's questionable practices. She was horrified, not just by the potential scandal, but by the idea that her precious son might be associated with criminal activity. Within an hour, she was calling him, demanding explanations and threatening to cut off his trust fund if he didn't distance himself from my family immediately. By the time I returned to the hotel with actual coffee and pastries, both their phones were exploding with calls and notifications. My stepbrother was frantically trying to reach his lawyer while fielding calls from panicked clients. My husband was staring at his phone in shock, reading news articles about his new brother-in-law's federal investigation. I walked in with the brightest smile I could manage and asked what was wrong. My husband showed me the headlines, and I gasped in perfect surprise. I told him how terrible this was for my family, how embarrassed I was, how I hoped this wouldn't reflect poorly on him. He assured me it wouldn't, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. This wasn't the kind of family scandal someone in his position could afford to be associated with. Over the next few hours, I watched both of them scramble. My stepbrother's business was hemorrhaging clients, and federal investigators were already requesting documents. My husband was getting calls from his firm's partners, expressing concern about potential conflicts of interest. The beautiful part was watching them turn on each other. My stepbrother started suggesting that maybe my husband should consider distancing himself from the family to protect his career. My husband began hinting that perhaps my stepbrother had involved him in conversations he shouldn't have been part of. By evening, my husband was suggesting we postpone our honeymoon indefinitely. He said he needed to focus on damage control at work and couldn't afford any distractions. I agreed completely, playing the supportive wife while internally celebrating every moment of his panic. Update 1. 3 days later, things escalated beyond even my expectations. The FBI raid on my stepbrother's office made the evening news, complete with footage of agents carrying out boxes of evidence. His business partner had indeed flipped, providing evidence of a much larger corruption scheme than I'd even suspected. My husband's firm put him on administrative leave pending their own internal investigation. Apparently, some of his questionable investment advice had actually violated federal regulations, and with the family connection to my stepbrother's case, they couldn't risk keeping him active. But the real masterpiece came when my stepbrother, desperate and facing potential prison time, decided to throw everyone under the bus. He started claiming that my husband had been involved in his schemes, that their conversation on our wedding night had been about covering up illegal activities, not about my marriage. My husband called me in a panic, asking if I remembered exactly what they discussed that night. I told him honestly that I'd been too tired to pay attention to their conversation, but that I was sure whatever they'd talked about was innocent. I was his wife, after all, and I trusted him completely. The irony was delicious. My stepbrother's attempt to save himself was destroying my husband's credibility, while my apparent loyalty was making me look like the perfect, supportive spouse caught in an unfortunate situation. Update 2. 2 weeks after our wedding, my husband asked for a separation. He claimed he needed space to deal with the legal issues and couldn't handle the stress of a new marriage on top of everything else. He suggested I move back in with my parents temporarily, just until things settled down. I agreed immediately, telling him I understood completely and that I'd support whatever decision he felt was best for his career. I even offered to hire my own lawyer to make sure our separation didn't create any additional legal complications for him. What he didn't know was that I'd already consulted with the best divorce attorney in the city. In our state, marriages could be annulled within the first year under certain circumstances, but the process required both parties to agree that the marriage was entered into under false pretenses or without full understanding of the commitment. I had no intention of making anything easy for him. Instead, I filed for legal separation, citing his abandonment and emotional distress. I also made sure to document everything: his request for separation, his concerns about being associated with my family, his admission that the marriage was causing him professional problems. Meanwhile, I started my own damage control campaign. I reached out to mutual friends and acquaintances, not to gossip, but to share how devastated I was by my stepbrother's actions and how proud I was of my husband for maintaining his integrity during such a difficult time. I painted myself as the innocent victim caught between two men's poor choices. The narrative I crafted was perfect. I was the loyal wife standing by her husband despite her own family's scandals, while he was the one choosing his career over our marriage. Update 3. 6 months later, the full scope of my revenge became clear. My stepbrother was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay millions in restitution. His business was completely destroyed, his assets frozen, and his reputation obliterated. The construction projects he'd signed off on were being re-inspected, and several buildings were found to have serious safety violations that could have resulted in catastrophic failures. My husband's career never recovered. Even though he wasn't criminally charged, the association with the scandal and his firm's internal investigation revealed enough questionable practices to make him unemployable in his field. His professional reputation was destroyed, and his family's social standing took a significant hit. But the real victory came in the divorce proceedings. Because he had initiated the separation and abandoned our marriage during a crisis, I was able to argue for significant alimony and a favorable division of assets. His lawyer tried to claim that the marriage had been too brief to warrant substantial support, but my attorney painted a compelling picture of a woman who had been abandoned by her husband when she needed him most. The judge was particularly unsympathetic to my husband's arguments, especially when it came out that he'd been discussing annulment with my stepbrother on our wedding night. My attorney had somehow obtained evidence of their conversation. I never asked how, and it made my husband look calculating and heartless. I walked away with enough money to start over completely, while both men lost everything they'd worked for. My stepbrother was in prison, and my husband was working retail while living in his parents' basement. The best part? Everyone still saw me as the victim in the situation. The sweet, innocent woman who'd been betrayed by her own family and abandoned by her husband when she needed support most. I received sympathy and support from everyone who knew the story, while they were viewed as the villains who destroyed their own lives through greed and poor judgment. Sometimes I wonder if they ever figured out that their conversation on our wedding night had been overheard. Whether they realized that their casual cruelty had set in motion the chain of events that destroyed both their lives. But mostly, I don't think about them at all anymore. I used the divorce settlement to start my own PR firm, specializing in crisis management and reputation repair. It's ironic, really. I've built a successful business helping people recover from the kind of scandals I orchestrated for my stepbrother and ex-husband. My first client was actually someone whose business had been destroyed by false accusations and media manipulation. Helping him rebuild his reputation and clear his name was incredibly satisfying, like balancing the scales of justice. I never remarried, but I'm not bitter about love or relationships. I learned valuable lessons about trust, about the importance of truly knowing someone before committing your life to them, and about the power of patience and strategic thinking. Sometimes people ask if I regret how things played out, if I wish I'd handled the situation differently. The truth is, I gave both of them every opportunity to be better men. My stepbrother could have chosen honesty and integrity in his business dealings. My husband could have chosen loyalty and respect in our marriage. They made their choices on that balcony, discussing my worth like I was a stock they were considering selling. I simply made sure they lived with the consequences of those choices. The morning after our wedding night, they woke up to headlines that changed everything. But the real headline, the one that mattered most, was written in the choices they'd made and the price they'd ultimately paid for underestimating the woman they thought they could discard so easily. Justice, I learned, doesn't always come from the courts or the law. Sometimes it comes from patience, preparation, and the willingness to let people destroy themselves with their own poor choices. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply giving people exactly what they deserve.